investing with the level of chaos just from the tariff policy alone. Anyway, there's a long set of things we should be talking about, and I'm happy to save some people some time, and let's get to it. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize the Chairman of the Task Force on Monetary Policy, Treasury Market Resilience, and Economic Prosperity, Mr. Lucas, for 1 minute for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing will allow us to evaluate the state of the economy and review the FOMC's policy decisions. It's appropriate to regularly take a step back and assess the central bank's performance and its responsiveness to the economic conditions our constituents face back home. This hearing is particularly timely conversation as the Fed wraps up its 5-year framework review, including a thorough look at the consensus statement, communication strategy, and other guiding policies that will have a profound effect on the lives of every American. Many of these topics we'll discuss today, we've taken a closer look at in the Monetary Policy, Treasury Market Resilience, and Economic Prosperity Task Force. I look forward to building on these conversations here. One issue that I think warrants special attention is the binding nature of the SLR and ESLR on the Treasury market intermediation. I'm glad to see the Fed is looking into this tomorrow, and I hope we'll see meaningful action soon. Chairman Powell, thank you for being here. It's critically important that Congress and the central bank have an open dialogue. Transparency, accountability, honest communications are pillars of our system's success. I look forward to your testimony on the state of the economy and the Fed's plans for the future. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize the ranking member of the Task Force on Monetary Policy, Treasury Market Resilience, and Economic Prosperity, Mr. Vargas, for 1 minute for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and thank you, Chairman Powell, both for your years of public service and for being here today. Since 1977, the Fed has been tasked by Congress with its dual mandate goals of achieving both maximum employment and stable prices. Unfortunately, this administration has made accomplishing these goals more difficult. In the Fed's most recent summary of economic projections, we see a forecast for slower growth, stickier inflation, and rising unemployment, all of which point to a potential stagflation scenario. Whether it's the president's indecision on trade policy, his hiring freezes impacting the collection of economic data, his ballooning of the deficit to cut taxes for the wealthy, or his name calling, all of these actions make it tougher for the Fed to do its job. I look forward to your testimony today, Mr. Powell, Chairman Powell, and I yield back with that.
Gentleman yields back. Today, we do welcome the testimony of the Honorable Jerome Powell, Chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System.
Consegue me escutar?
Chairman Powell, we thank you for taking time to be with us. You'll be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your written testimony, and without objection, your written testimony will be made part of the record. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Pessoal, se puder me avisar se vocês conseguem me escutar, eu agradeço. Sim, ok.
Thank you, Chairman Hill, Ranking Member, and other members of the committee. It's great to be back here today. I appreciate the opportunity to present the Federal Reserve's semi-annual monetary policy report. The Federal Reserve remains squarely focused on achieving our dual mandate goals of maximum employment and stable prices for the benefit of the American people. Despite elevated uncertainty, the economy is in a solid position.
Ele falou que a economia
Employment
está
rate remains
sólida.
low, and the labor market is at or near maximum employment. Inflation has come down a great deal.
A
It has
inflação
been
caiu
running somewhat
bastante.
above our 2% longer run objective. We are attentive to the risks on both sides of our dual mandate. I will review the current economic situation before turning to monetary policy. Incoming data suggests that the economy remains solid. Following growth of 2.5% last year, GDP was reported to have edged down in the first
A
quarter.
economia continua
Swings in
crescendo
net
aqui nos
exports
Estados
that were
Unidos.
driven by businesses bringing in imports ahead of potential tariffs. This unusual swing has complicated GDP measurement. Private domestic final
E de olho no
purchases, or
GDP essa semana,
PDP,
quinta-feira.
which excludes net exports, inventory investment, and government spending, grew at a solid 2.5% rate. Within PDFP, growth of consumer spending moderated, while investment in equipment and intangibles rebounded from weakness in the fourth quarter. Surveys of households and businesses, however, report a decline in sentiment in recent months and elevated uncertainty about the economic outlook, largely reflecting trade policy concerns. It remains to be seen how these developments might affect future spending and investment. In the labor market, conditions have remained solid. Payroll job gains averaged a moderate 224,000 per month in the first 5 months of the year. The unemployment rate at 4.2% in May remains low and has stayed in a narrow range for the past year. Wage growth has continued to moderate while still outpacing inflation. Overall, a wide set of indicators suggests that the conditions in the labor market are broadly in balance and consistent with maximum employment. The labor market is not a source of significant inflationary pressures. The strong labor market conditions in recent years have helped narrow longstanding disparities in employment and earnings across demographic groups. Inflation has eased significantly from its highs in
Bitcoin
mid-2022, but remains
$105.229.
somewhat elevated relative to our 2% longer run goal. Estimates based on the Consumer Price Index and other data indicate that total personal consumption expenditures, or PCE prices, rose 2.3% over the 12 months ending in May, and that, excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 2.6%. Near-term measures of inflation expectations have moved up over recent months, as reflected in both market and survey-based measures. Respondents to surveys of consumers, businesses, and professional forecasters point to tariffs as the driving factor. Beyond the next year or so, however, most measures of longer-term expectations remain consistent with our 2% inflation goal. Our monetary policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. With the labor market at or near maximum employment and inflation remaining somewhat elevated, the Federal Open Market Committee has maintained the target range for the federal funds rate at 4.25% to 4.5% since the beginning of the year. We've also continued to reduce our holdings of Treasury and agency mortgage-backed securities, and beginning in April, further slowed the pace of this decline to facilitate a smooth
Agora é
transition
normal, pessoal.
to ample reserve balances. We will continue to determine the appropriate stance of monetary policy based on the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks.
Mesma coisa de sempre.
Policy changes continue to evolve, and their effects on the economy remain uncertain. The effects of tariffs will depend, among other things, on their ultimate level. Expectations of that level, and thus of the related economic effects, reached a peak in April and have since declined. Even so, increases in tariffs this year are likely to push up prices and weigh on economic activity. The effects on inflation could be short-lived, reflecting a one-time shift in the price level. It's also possible that the inflationary effects could instead be more persistent. Avoiding that would depend on the size of the tariff effects, on how long it takes for them to pass through fully into prices, and ultimately on keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Our obligation is to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored and to prevent a one-time increase in the price level from becoming an ongoing inflation problem. As we act to meet that obligation, we will balance our maximum employment and price stability mandates, keeping in mind that without price stability, we cannot achieve the long periods of strong labor market conditions that benefit all Americans. For the time being, we are well positioned to wait to learn more about the likely course of the economy before considering any adjustments to our policy stance. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll now turn to member questions. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions.
Não vejo ele
For the past few
cortando
weeks,
taxa de
our
juros.
Democratic colleagues have suggested the
momento.
following: after the initial release of the GDP report, the president is driving the economy into a recession. Chairman Powell, the latest FOMC statement described economic activity to continue to expand at a solid pace, and you just reiterated that in your testimony this morning. In your view, is the term recession and the economy growing at a solid pace, are those synonymous with each
Se
other?
lembrem do Paul
I would say
Volcker.
no.
Se lembrem do Paul Volcker.
You note that the labor market continues strong, the economy's at a standard pace, and you also referenced in your testimony that first quarter GDP initial react was also from front-end loading, as you noted, imports to try to avoid tariff impacts. Also, I looked at the Atlanta Fed GDP Now model, which forecasts GDP growth for the second quarter of this year at nearly 4%, with core GDP forecast at 2%. Does that Atlanta model suggest a recession to you?
No, I would say it doesn't.
So, in looking at your remarks
Ele
about
perguntou se nós
tariffs
estamos
today
em
and
risco
then
de
the
entrar
ones
numa
that you
recessão,
made
ele falou que
during
não.
March and April, I was looking back at a Fed study that noted that up until March, tariffs have already been partially passed through in consumer prices, leading to a contribution of merely 0.1 percentage point increase in core PCE prices. And a Harvard study last week showed that prices have only modestly adjusted since the announcement of tariffs. Finally, the longer-term inflation expectations remain consistent with the 2% goal. Governor Waller laid out a pathway that allows for rate cuts provided that
Ele
average
falou que o
effective
governor
tariff
Waller
rates remain close to
falou que está
10% or I assume remains
interessado em
10%
cortar
or
a taxa
lower.
de juros, né? Então, para
The
isso,
labor market remains solid,
eu
prices
perguntando
continue
agora
to
para ele, vamos ver o que ele
disinflate.
vai
So
falar.
given that data I've outlined, I'm sure data that you're very familiar with, for the economy to avoid persistent inflation, do you concur with Governor Waller that there is a pathway for good news as it relates to the regulatory policies,
Essa
the
pergunta é
tax
muito
policies
importante.
that I've discussed in a world with lower tariff rates?
So first, I wouldn't comment on any other FOMC members' comments one way or the other, but I will say this. I think many paths are possible here, and certainly the one you mentioned is a possible one. We could see inflation come in not as strong as we expect. And if that were the case, that would tend to suggest cutting sooner. We could see the labor market
Positivo.
weakening, and
Ele
that would
falou
also
que se os dados
suggest
da
cutting sooner. On the
inflação
other hand, if we see
em
inflation
abaixo
coming
da
in higher or if labor
expectativa
market
ou ele estiver satisfeito com os dados da inflação,
remains strong,
ele pode
then we
considerar
would probably
cortar a
be
taxa
moving
de
later.
juros
So I
antes,
think a range of possible
talvez
paths are
julho.
possible, and
Ele
certainly the
falou
one you mentioned is one of them.
que ele não gosta de comentar muito no que os outros
In
advogam
February of
falam, mas ele
2021,
fala assim, tem vários caminhos
you
e um deles
told
pode
us
ser
in this committee that you would stay
corte
in
da
your
taxa
lane
de
and not
juros mais
comment
cedo.
on
Então, até agora, tudo
President
por
Biden's proposal for the American Rescue Plan or sharply
Bitcoin
increasing federal spending.
$105.3.
And, you said it was an issue, but that you would stay in your lane and not comment on it. But here in this year, you have commented on this idea of tariffs being set by the executive branch. So are tariffs in your lane, but a huge fiscal spending by the Biden administration not in your lane?
Lembre
Explain
que
to
ele
the committee
continua
why
falando
you
amanhã,
chose to
e
be
daí nós
silent in
temos o
February of
GP
21,
do
but
PCE na
outspoken
quinta e
this spring.
sexta-feira.
Sure. So we haven't commented, and it would be inappropriate for us to comment on the policy of tariffs. We don't have a view. It's not our job. And we just wouldn't do that. And just as we wouldn't comment on the
Quinta-feira,
reconciliation
GDP.
package that you're working on right now. We're not commenting on tariffs. What our job is inflation, keeping inflation under control, and also keeping maximum employment.
Sexta-feira,
And when policies have what appear to be
PCE.
short and medium term implications, meaningful implications for that, then they kind of, not the policies themselves, but the inflation becomes our job.
Yeah. You know my views on price stability. I think it's a first among equals in your dual mandate. I've argued for that. I've introduced legislation to make the dual mandate the sole mandate, and we've talked about that before. But I was very curious about your thoughts on former president of the Cleveland Bank, Loretta Mester's quote that I read from last fall. She says, "I think that maximum employment is the maximum level of employment consistent with price stability." In other words, she elegantly ties that together, that price stability is what you can have more control over rather than, all these other factors that enter the employment picture like legislative and executive branch. What's your thought about her quote?
I personally think that's a very reasonable way to think about it.
Thank you very much. I yield back. The gentleman from New York is recognized for
Agora,
5 minutes.
bullish,
Thank you,
pessoal.
Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chair, Chair Powell, and thank you for being here. Last week, the FOMC decided to maintain the target range for the federal funds rate at 4.25% to 4.5%. While I was not surprised by the decision to hold rates
Não é
steady, I
momento
was
de fazer
surprised
nada
by
na
the
emoção,
committee's
tá? Não é momento de
revised
fazer nada na
forecast
emoção.
since March,
Nada,
which
nada, nada
represented
na
a
emoção.
decrease of 0.3
Tudo tem que ser
percentage
feito
points
bem
for
pensado.
GDP,
Isso daqui
a
é
similar
só
increase for
a
core
fala do
PCE,
JP, né?
and an uptick in the unemployment rate to 4.5%. Can you explain the incoming data that the committee has seen since March that caused it to make these adjustments?
Sure. So first of all, these are individual. This is not a committee forecast. These are just individuals submitting their own personal, forecasts, and we don't bless those as a committee. But I think people are looking at the incoming data and having a range of different judgments. If you look at the range, if you look at the central tendency, you'll see that it covers quite a wide range. Those are the medians that you're talking about. I think so. Inflation is projected to have moved up because of what we've seen, particularly from tariffs. And I think if you look at other outside forecasters, you'll see very much the same thing.
And
the
what
same is also
data are
true.
you looking for?
Well, we look at the incoming data on, we look at our own forecast and we ask ourselves what's likely to happen. You know, monetary policy has to be forward-looking. A forecast is a prediction of what's going to happen in the future.
Thank you. In its statement, the committee announced that it will continue to monitor the implications of incoming data and adjust the stand of monetary policy as appropriate. Some analysts predict 2 rate cuts by the end of the year are still on the table. Is this a fair and accurate assumption? And what incoming data will the committee need to see to consider these cuts?
What will actually happen with rates is going to depend on the path of the economy, and that's highly uncertain. So I would just say what that means at this moment in time is that a significant majority of the committee, but also there's a pretty significant minority that doesn't agree, but a significant majority feels it will be appropriate to reduce rates later this year. And what that means is that each of those persons who wrote down a cut in rates later this year, they think that there's some state of the world where inflation doesn't prove to be as high, or the labor market weakens, or some combination of those two things, that it will turn out to be more likely than not appropriate to reduce policy rates, subject to great uncertainty. I mean, we will.
Então, tem alguns membros do Fed que acham que é apropriado para cortar a taxa de juro esse ano, e tem outros que acham que não é apropriado. Então, a gente está vendo aqui que eles estão divididos, entendeu? Que eles estão ali, metade quer cortar, a outra metade acha que não é hora ainda, que a gente tem que continuar prestando atenção nos dados que vão sair, GDP, PCE, CPI, e qual o efeito que as tarifas vão ter na economia dos Estados Unidos. Mas até agora, bullish.
You know, the story has been evolving, and our thinking has been adapting, and that will continue.
Thank you. Chair Powell, although a ceasefire has been tentatively reached in the Middle East, the situation still has the potential to open global and energy markets, especially if the ceasefire is broken. While at this point, Iran is seen as unlikely to close the Strait of Hormuz, that decision could change. How is the Fed assessing the current situation and incorporating those assessments as it considers future adjustment to economic projections and its stand on monetary policy?
Negócio do petróleo.
I think it's too early to know what any economic implications might be, and I would not want to speculate. Like everyone else, we are, of course, watching the situation.
Sobre nada disso. Ele quer responder, não responde.
And Chair Powell, after reviewing the economic data following the meeting last week, it seems to me that the committee is indicating that we could be headed for a situation where inflation accelerates while unemployment rises and growth become more sluggish.
Ela está perguntando se a gente pode encontrar uma situação em que a inflação dá uma acelerada e o nível de desemprego aumenta. Ela está preocupada e o que ele
balance these priorities in order to achieve.
E como afeta as suas prioridades isso acontecer.
We're not facing that right now, and that is really our forecast that we will face such an issue in a serious way. But if that does happen, then what we do is we look at the two goals and we see which one of them is farther from its goal. Two variables, you know, is maximum employment or price stability farther from its goal, and we prefer the one that's farther than its goal. And then we also ask ourselves, how quickly will they return to goal? It's a very difficult situation for
eles estão tentando estabilizar os preços, controlar a economia. Então ele falou que se isso acontecer, ele vai ver qual dos dois está mais longe de bater a meta e trabalhar.
Thank you, Chair Hill and Chair Powell. Good to see you again. I got a lot to cover, so we're going to try and keep this concise. But following up a bit on what Chair Hill had been talking about, you know, you had said in January 29, 2025, quote, we don't know what will happen with tariffs, with immigration, with fiscal policy, and with regulatory policy. I would add energy.
Eu vou parar por aqui, pessoal, porque eu tenho que ir, tá? Eu acho que se ele continuar, eu acho que se ele não cortar essa taxa de juro rápido, ele vai quebrar o país. Essa é a minha opinião. A gente já sente aqui nos Estados Unidos que os negócios estão tudo falindo, o que tem de propriedade comercial desocupada. Eu já estou vendo prédios comerciais desocupados há 4 anos. Eu falei muito isso em 2022. Pequenos negócios fechando, entendeu? Então ele está acabando com os pequenos negócios, ele está destruindo com tudo com essa atitude dele. Todos os países já cortaram, entendeu? Então eu falei assim, em 2022, 2023, eu falei muito. Ele é fã do Powell Volcker, né? O que o Powell Volcker fez para controlar a inflação? Ele mandou a economia para uma forte e profunda recessão. Se é isso que ele está tentando fazer, entendeu? Ele vai conseguir. Porque não interessa o que está mostrando no stock market. Eu posso olhar para o S&P 500 e está lá mais de $6.000. O que interessa é as famílias aqui sofrendo, que ele falou aqui que as famílias estão sofrendo, que as decisões dele afetam as famílias. Aqui nos Estados Unidos, pessoal, o pessoal ganha para comer, a maioria das pessoas aqui, entendeu? A maioria das pessoas aqui estão problema. Não pense que o americano está nadando em dinheiro, porque não está. A maioria das pessoas aqui não tem nem $500 na conta de banco, entendeu? Os americanos estão passando apuro, certo? Essa é a realidade, tá? Antes um cara solteiro conseguia morar num apartamento de 2 quartos, 3 quartos. Hoje um cara solteiro que não tem nenhuma, que não tem uma profissão bacana, ele não consegue nem alugar um quarto, entendeu? Ou ele pode trabalhar 80, 90 horas por semana na construção, lavando prato, fazendo alguma coisa, só que se ele for tentar ter uma casa, ele vai trabalhar só para casa, carro, comida e conta. Então esse camarada que trabalha 80, 90 horas, ele tem que morar num quarto, ou sei lá o que ele tem que fazer, entendeu? Porque não tem condição. Uma pessoa em Nova York tem que ganhar pelo menos $2.000 por semana, e a maioria não ganha $2.000, a maioria ganha entre $600 e $1.500 por aí por semana. Então, muito difícil, muito difícil. E se ele continuar assim, ele vai quebrar o país, entendeu? Então, eu não sei o que vai acontecer, eu não sei por quanto tempo ele vai segurar essa taxa de juro, mas desse jeito aí, fica muito difícil, muito difícil. Donald Trump está certo, ele tem que cortar, todos os outros países cortaram, ele precisa cortar urgente isso daí, tá? Bitcoin agora 105.461 dólares. Então, assim, você olha para o S&P 500, você vê lá mais de $6.000, mas aquilo ali é o Big Tech, é Microsoft, é Tesla, é Nvidia, é Amazon, entendeu? Tudo companhia que faz dinheiro com os pobres. É ou não é? Hã? Não é? Entendeu? E eles estão neném e os pobres têm que aprender a usar tecnologia, senão vão ficar mais pobres. Então, assim, tem que aprender a usar inteligência artificial, tem que aprender a usar mídia, social media, entendeu? Tem que aprender a mover rápido, porque trabalhando da forma tradicional vai ser muito difícil, pessoal, entendeu? Então, assim, aqui tá tudo fechando, tá? Aqui tá tudo fechando. Os comércios tradicionais, o que tá bombando é tudo online, negócios online, tudo online, tá indo bem. Os negócios tradicionais tá tudo ruim e o povo americano tá sem grana. Essa é a verdade. O povo americano endividado, tudo cheio de problema. E é claro que existe uma porcentagem de gente que está indo muito bem, claro, entendeu? Os profissionais estão indo bem, dentista, advogado, ou gente que sabe, que tem um carpinteiro, um encanador, estão indo muito bem, entendeu? Mas quem não tem nenhuma habilidade, que a maioria do povo está no sufoco, entendeu? Então não sei quanto tempo esse camarada vai demorar para cortar a taxa de juro, mas se ele manter a taxa de juro desse jeito, vai ser bem difícil. Então, para concluir, fiquem de olho no GDP quinta-feira, PCE sexta-feira, tá bom? Muito obrigado a todos. Em geral, a fala dele foi dovish, eu não terminei porque eu tenho que ir embora, tenho coisa para fazer, mas em geral foi dovish e vale a pena lembrar que ele fala amanhã. Então é engraçado como essas falas são sempre antes de grandes resultados, né? Nunca é depois. Você vê que ele sempre fala antes do GDP ou antes do PCE. E daí a fala dele é até tem que olhar para o PCE, tem que olhar para o CPI, tem que olhar para o GDP. Ele nunca fala depois, entendeu? Ele fala depois do dado anterior, mas antes do dado atual. Sendo que o dado atual está atrasado também. Então, assim, parece um show de comédia. Se você parar para pensar, é um show de comédia, entendeu? É toda vez você fala, olha, eu tenho que olhar o dado que está vindo, né? Você entendeu? Por que não faz uma análise no dia que sai o dado? Entendeu? Assim, faça o que você quiser fazer, mas o cara é mestre mesmo em enrolar, está enrolando a gente 4 anos. Tem que cortar a taxa de juro urgente para ontem, entendeu? Isso daí já era para ter acontecido faz tempo. Donald Trump está certo, ele está acabando com tudo, está custando o país bilhões de dólares, não só o país, mas o mundo, entendeu? Está custando o mundo bilhões de dólares, sei lá quantos dólares está custando isso daí, tá bom? Então um abração para todo mundo, fico com Deus, como sempre. Não desanima não, hein? Tamo junto, pessoal. Vamos ver aí a reação do Bitcoin e vamos fazer o que ele disse, de olho no GDP, de olho no PCE. Mas, em geral, a fala dele foi, entendeu? De acordo com a expectativa, eles vão mantendo a taxa de juro. Se a inflação for controlada, eles cortam a taxa de juro antes. Para resumir, o que ele falou foi isso, entendeu? Não continuei para ver o que ele vai falar depois, mas até onde eu vi foi isso aí a tradução, entendeu? Então, continuamos no mode wait and see, vamos aguardar e ver e aguardar para ver o que vai acontecer. Tá bom? Tamo junto.